Hey, my name is Bill Ferriter, and it's time for another 10-minute team tip. Now, I've got an interesting question for you up on the screen. One of the things that I oftentimes believe is that collaboration between teachers can be considerably frustrating. Odds are, especially if you're new to collaboration, you've experienced that considerable frustration. Can you think for a quick minute about what it is that makes collaboration between colleagues so frustrating? Pause your video for a second and have that conversation with each other now. That's one of my very favorite questions to ask in any presentation that I give, because years ago I asked one of my collaborative teams what caused us considerable frustration. At the time I was working with three ladies. They were some of the most motivated and educated professionals I ever worked with. They pretty much had changed my practice more than anyone on earth. And when I said to them, hey, is our work ever frustrating? They said, of course it is, Bill. And then I said, well, what causes the frustration on our team? They just sort of laughed. When I said to them, why are you laughing? They said, you really don't know, do you? And I was like, well, no what? They said, Bill, the cause of considerable frustration on our collaborative team is you. Now that caught me by surprise. Obviously, I didn't go to my collaborative team meetings intentionally trying to frustrate my peers. When I asked them to explain why I was frustrating or how I was frustrating the work of our group, they said, Bill, you're oftentimes a hammer. And when I asked them what that means, what they meant by that, they said, you can be really confident and assertive. And in fact, that confidence and assertion takes over our conversation sometimes. Bill, we don't always feel like we can get a word in edgewise while you're at the table. It's super interesting, isn't it? My colleagues had never said that to me before, but what they were describing was a moment when my personality was interfering with the work of the group. And what's super important to understand is that I didn't go to my meetings intentionally trying to be overly confident or overly assertive and take over the work of the group. Instead, I was just being me. That's who I am. And in reality, I felt like I was bringing a lot of positives to the group too. I mean, when there was heavy lifting to get done, things that needed to be finished, I oftentimes was the one that was willing to stay late and get those things done. I made tons of contributions to my group, but there were moments when my personality prevented the work of our group from moving forward in a healthy way. Now, I'm sure that you'll be surprised by how I responded. I looked right back at my peers and said, oh yeah, well, you're a bunch of pencils. Maybe not my most professional response. What did I mean by that? Well, my colleagues were incredible dreamers. They had fantastic ideas about how to teach things to students, but oftentimes they would dream up plans, instructional strategies that were fantastic and motivating and engaging, and yet completely impossible to pull off. Things that we could never do without leaving ourselves completely and totally exhausted and overwhelmed. Do you see what I'm doing? I was describing moments when their personalities were interfering with the work of the group. And what's just as interesting is that I had never told my peers that. We had never had a conversation about it. I had never interrupted them in the moments when they were dreaming the impossible dream to say, hey guys, maybe we should dial that back. There's a point here that I'm trying to make. We very much need to have conversations about our personalities with our peers. That's not a surprise. You probably have done that 1,000 times in education before. Usually the beginning of the year PD meeting starts off with some personality typing activity, whether it's an Enneagrams or the Myers-Briggs test, whether it's True North or True Colors. But we rarely use those personality typing activities to really reflect on what happens to move our groups forward and to hold our groups back. Instead, we need to talk openly about how our personalities are moving our groups forward and holding our groups back. And then we need to use those conversations as a part of a strategy to call out our peers in those moments when their behavior is derailing the work of our group. What did that look like on my collaborative team once we had had conversations about, Bill, you're a hammer, and oh yeah, well, you're a bunch of pencils? What happened next was my colleagues started to use that phrase, Bill, you're being a hammer right now, as a check for me in the moments when my personality was interfering with the work of the group. When they felt like I was being too confident or too assertive, when my when my interactions were preventing them from getting involved, my peers would just say, "Bill, you're being a hammer right now." That was a check for me in the moment. It was a way for them to say safely to me, "Hey, Bill, you're taking over the conversation." And it was all that I needed to hear in order to be able to check myself, in order to be able to step back and allow them to be more involved in the work that we were doing. I used my metaphor for them. "Hey guys, you're being pencils right now. Great idea, pencils." I used that as a check for them too. If they were dreaming the impossible dream again, getting us into an overly complicated activity that we may not be able to pull off, I was able to say, "Great idea, pencils, but can we really do that right now?" Do you see what I'm saying? We have to talk about personalities with each other. It's essential, because personalities really is the reason why we either succeed or struggle in collaborative groups. But the mistake we make when we talk about personalities is we don't use our conversations to create a strategy or a process that we can use to call our peers out when their personalities interfere with the work of the group. And what ends up happening is personalities interfere with the work of the group, and we just sit there and smile and nod and hope for the meeting to end, right? That's not healthy behavior, and it doesn't lead to effective or efficient functioning of a team. So I have a recommendation for you. I really do want you to talk about personalities with your peers. I want you to ask them, "Hey, which tool in a toolbox best represents your personality and why?" And don't forget to consider both your strengths and your weaknesses. What might that conversation end up looking like? Well, maybe members of your team might create an organizer like Allison has on the left, where she's thought about what are my strengths and what are my weaknesses. She's listed the positives she brings to teams and the negatives that she brings to teams. And then once you've had that conversation, I want you to turn that into a strategy or a code to address moments when people's personalities interfere with the work of the group. I want Allison's colleagues to be able to say to her, "Hey, Allison, you're being a hammer right now," and immediately she can check her behavior. That's what's missing from most of our conversations about personalities. We certainly know when somebody's driving us crazy on our collaborative team, right? That's not hard to sort out or get to the bottom of. But we don't have a safe way to address those moments with our peers. We don't have a safe way to mention to them, "Hey, right now, you're the reason why we're frustrated in our collaborative work." So when you're considering doing this activity, if you'd like an individual handout to guide your thinking, there's one linked in the session description right at the bottom of this video. And really and truly, I think it's an essential conversation for you to have with one another. If you haven't spoken about your personalities, and if you have no way to address moments when people's personalities interfere with the work of the group, I'm not sure that you're going to be terribly successful at moving forward in your collaborative work. Another resource that I can provide you for help is also linked in the session notes. If you're interested in using my slides, they're also linked there too. And check out the session notes. There's some description in the session notes about what I might say on each of those individual slides. Let me give you one last reminder. This is super important. Here's Deb Mashek. She researches collaboration in the workspace. And what she says is that if there's one low-quality collaborative relationship on a team, it has negative impacts. And what are those impacts? Poor mental health, burnout, job dissatisfaction, and turnover. So if you've always thought that conversations about personalities were unnecessary, if you've ever thought that they were just warm, fuzzy things you did at the beginning of the year, but they didn't really have an impact on the real work of your collaborative team, there's some research to prove you wrong. There's nothing that you can do to strengthen the work of your team that's more effective and more efficient than talking about your personalities and creating a strategy that everyone can agree to, where you'll call one another out if your personality happens to be interfering with the work of the group. All right, well, I hope that has value to you. I hope you learned a little something. If you have questions, feel free to shoot me an email. And make sure you hit the like or subscribe button so that you can get updated the next time I post another 10-minute team tip. Thanks so much. Good luck.